The gun was already aimed when she walked to his table. She did not know that yet. Nobody in the restaurant knew that. The diners were cutting their food and talking about small things. The candles on the tables were burning low. A piano was playing somewhere near the back wall, something slow and forgettable. The whole room felt like the end of a normal evening, the kind of Tuesday night that leaves no mark on anyone. But across the street, on the fourth floor of a building that sold insurance during the day and was completely empty at night, a man was lying on his stomach behind a window that had been opened exactly 6 inches. He had been there for 3 hours. He was patient in the way that only certain people learn to be patient, the kind of patience that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with purpose. He had one job tonight. He had been paid very well for it. The only thing standing between him and that payment was time, and time was running out. His name does not matter. What matters is the red dot. Carmelo Vitanza was 54 years old, and he had survived things that should have ended him a long time ago. He had survived a car that was set on fire while he was still inside it, at the age of 31. He had survived 2 court cases that should have sent him away for decades. He had survived men who were stronger than him, smarter than him, and angrier than him, because he had one quality that outlasted all of those things. He paid attention. He noticed the world around him the way most people never bother to, and in the kind of life he had built for himself, that attention had been the difference between breathing and not breathing on more than one occasion. He sat in the corner booth of Aldo's restaurant, which was on the ground floor of a narrow building on a quiet street in the city. He sat with his back against the wall, the way he always sat. From where he was positioned, he could see the front door, the side hallway that led to the kitchen, and most of the other tables. The 2 men who sat with him were not there for the food, though they ordered it. They were there because where Carmelo went, they went. His name meant nothing to the other diners. To them, he was simply a well-dressed older man with gray at his temples and the kind of stillness that some people carry when they have seen too much of the world to be impressed by any single piece of it. He ate carefully. He drank half a glass of wine and left the rest. He spoke quietly, and when he spoke, the 2 men across from him listened without interrupting. He had ordered the lamb. It had not arrived yet. The waitress who was supposed to bring it was named Claire Whitmore. She was 26 years old and had been working at Aldo's for 3 months. Before this job, she had worked at a coffee shop near the university, and before that, she had studied 1 year of nursing school before deciding it was not for her. She was not trained in anything that would seem useful in a moment of danger. She was trained to remember orders, to carry plates without spilling, to smile at customers even when she did not feel like smiling, and to notice things about her section that needed attention. That last skill was the one that mattered tonight. She had picked up Carmelo's table as part of her normal rotation for the evening. She did not know who he was. She had refilled his water glass once already, had smiled at him when she took his order, and had not thought about him again, except in the ordinary way a waitress thinks about the tables she is responsible for. She was moving between the kitchen and the dining room at a steady pace, the kind of pace you develop after a few months on your feet every night. At 9:14, she was near the far wall of the restaurant, setting down 2 plates at a table by the window. The couple at that table were looking at each other and not at her. She was looking at the table to make sure everything was placed correctly. That was when she saw it. It was on the wall behind the couple, just above and to the left of where the man was sitting. A small point of red light, barely the size of a fingernail. It was moving in a slow, almost lazy circle, not like a reflection from a glass or a candle. Reflections from glasses and candles move when the source moves, and nothing in the restaurant was moving. This dot moved on its own, in its own small orbit, and then it drifted. It floated to the right. Then it stilled. Claire straightened up and walked back toward the kitchen. She was halfway there when her feet slowed down, not because she made a decision to slow down. Her body made that decision for her, before her mind had finished thinking through what her eyes had seen. She stood for a moment in the middle of the restaurant floor, with 2 empty hands, and something cold beginning at the base of her throat. Red light on a wall that had no source for red light, moving as if guided, drifting as if searching. She turned and looked at the corner booth. The red dot was not visible from where she stood now. The angle was wrong, but she understood, in the way that the body understands things before the brain can explain them, that the dot had not been searching the back wall for something interesting to look at. It had been moving because whatever held it on the other end was making small adjustments, waiting for something to line up. She did not know she was right. She was not certain of anything. She was a 26-year-old waitress in a restaurant who had seen a small light on a wall and had a feeling that she could not name and could not fully justify. She was also, without fully understanding it, standing at one of those moments where a person's next action either matters enormously or means nothing at all, and there is no way to know which it is until after you have already acted. She picked up the lamb from the pass and walked toward the corner booth. Her heart was going fast. She did not show it. She had learned from nursing school, before she left it, that the face and the body do not have to tell the same story at the same time, and she used that knowledge now, keeping her expression easy and professional, while everything underneath it was pulling tight. The man at the head of the booth looked up when she approached. His eyes were calm and direct, the kind of eyes that take a measurement of everything they look at. She had noticed those eyes when she first took his order. She noticed them again now. She set the lamb on the table in front of him. Then she leaned in, and she said, in a voice that was low enough that only he could hear it, that there was a problem with his order, and she needed him to come to the kitchen for a moment. He looked at her for exactly 2 seconds. Most people, hearing that sentence from a waitress in the middle of dinner, would ask what kind of problem. They would want clarification. They would be confused, or annoyed, or both. This man did neither. What he did was look at her long enough to read something in her face that she had not put into words, and then he looked at the man to his left, the one who sat closest to the window, and something passed between them without a single word being spoken. He stood up from the booth. He moved toward the kitchen doorway. The red dot tracked him across the room. Then it lost him. Then it swung back to the empty booth. And then the window exploded inward. The shot went through the glass and tore through the leather of the corner booth, exactly at the height where a seated man's chest would have been. It hit the back wall and left a hole the size of a fist in the plaster. The sound of it cracked through the restaurant like a single, enormous hand clap, and for 1 full second, no one in the room moved or made a sound. Then, everything happened at once. Carmelo was already through the kitchen door. His 2 men were moving before the sound had finished echoing, one of them pushing tables aside, the other with his hand inside his jacket, heading for the side exit. The diners who had been having quiet Tuesday evening meals were suddenly standing, or crouching, or pressing against walls, their plates forgotten, their conversations over, their ordinary Tuesday gone, in 1 cracked second of sound and flying glass. Claire was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had the empty tray in her hands. She was not moving. She was looking at the corner booth, at the ruined leather, and the hole in the plaster, at the space where a man had been sitting less than 10 seconds ago. She was thinking about the dot on the wall. She had been right. She had not been certain that she was right. She had acted anyway. Her hands, she noticed, were completely steady. The lamb was still on the table, untouched. Outside, on the 4th floor of the insurance building, a man was already moving toward the stairwell. He left nothing behind except a window that had been opened 6 inches and the particular silence of a room where someone had waited a long time for something that did not happen. By the time the police arrived, he was already gone. But so was Carmelo. And he was breathing. The kitchen of Aldo's restaurant was not built for crowds, and yet by 9:20 it held more people than it was designed to handle. There were 2 cooks pressed against the far counter, a dishwasher who had not stopped washing dishes because he did not know what else to do, a manager named Paul Dunning who was on the phone with someone and keeping his voice very low, and Carmelo Vitanza, who was sitting on a metal stool near the prep station with his hands folded in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. The 2 men who had been at his table were not in the kitchen. They were outside, doing things that Carmelo did not need to supervise because they had done them before. One of them was on the phone. The other was walking the perimeter of the building across the street with a flashlight, which was technically not his job, and technically not legal, but no one was going to stop him tonight. Claire was leaning against the wall near the back door. Someone had handed her a glass of water, and she was holding it without drinking it. She had answered 3 questions already, from Paul the manager, who was panicking, and from one of the cooks, who was not panicking, but was asking questions anyway, because it was better than standing in silence. She had told them what she saw, the red dot on the wall, the movement of it, the decision she made. When she finished telling it, both of them looked at her in a way she had seen before, the way people look at something they cannot quite place in the category they have ready for it. Carmelo had not asked her anything yet. He had been watching her from the metal stool since she came into the kitchen, Not in a way that felt threatening, but in the way of a man who is taking inventory of something, deciding what it is and what it means. The police arrived at 9:27. She heard the cars before she heard the voices, and then there were uniformed officers in the dining room, and someone was asking everyone to stay where they were. Paul went to meet them. One officer came to the kitchen door and looked in and said something about statements, and then a second person came through behind him who was not in uniform. A woman in a dark coat who had the particular quality of stillness that police detectives carry. The kind of stillness that means they are watching everything at once without appearing to watch anything at all. Her name was Frances Keene. She introduced herself to the room without looking for a response, and then she looked directly at Claire and said, "You're the one who moved him." It was not a question. Claire said yes. Frances Keene sat down at the prep counter and took out a small notebook, the old-fashioned kind with a wire spiral at the top, and she looked at Claire and said, "Tell me exactly what you saw and exactly what you did. Don't leave anything out and don't add anything in." Claire told her. She started with the couple by the window. She described the plates she had set down and the position she had been standing in when she noticed the light. She described the dot as precisely as she could, its size, its color, its movement. She described the moment her feet slowed on the way back to the kitchen. She described walking to the booth and what she said, and the way the man had looked at her for 2 seconds, and then stood without asking for an explanation. When she was done, Frances Keene looked at her for a moment without writing anything. Then she said, "You said the dot was moving in a circle." Claire said yes, a slow circle, almost like it was rocking slightly. Frances Keene wrote something down. She said, "The window on the 4th floor across the street had been propped open with a piece of wood. The angle from that window to this booth is consistent with what you described. Whoever was there had been there a while. Long positions, long wait, sometimes the hands drift." She said this in a very flat voice, as if she were talking about weather. Claire thought about that. A man lying on a floor in an empty building across the street for hours, waiting. She thought about the patience that required. She thought about what the patience was for. She took a sip of water. Carmelo spoke for the first time since she had entered the kitchen. He said, without raising his voice, "What made you stop? On the way back to the kitchen. You said your feet slowed down. What made that happen?" Frances Keene looked at him briefly, then looked back at her notebook. Claire thought about the question. It was a fair question. She had been asking herself the same thing since the glass broke. She said, "I knew where the light should not have been. Every table near that wall has candles. The candles throw light up and sideways, never across. There's nothing red in that section of the room. No exit signs, no decorative lights, nothing. The dot was red, and it was moving horizontally across a wall that had no source for it. I don't think I added all of that up consciously. I think my brain just flagged it as wrong before I had the words for it." Carmelo looked at her for a long moment. 3 months working here, he said. She was not sure if it was a question. She said yes. He said, "You noticed something that trained men have missed before." She did not know what to say to that. She did not say anything. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The dishwasher had finally stopped washing dishes. Even the sound from the dining room, the officers moving, the sound of furniture being photographed and measured, seemed to dim for a few seconds. Then Carmelo said, "You saved my life." He said it in the same quiet, factual tone he had used for everything else, not with emotion, not with drama, as a statement of observable reality. Claire looked at her glass of water. She said, "I wasn't sure I was right." He said, "Most people who are sure of something in a moment like that are sure of the wrong thing. The ones who act on the not quite sure are the ones worth paying attention to." Frances Keene had stopped writing. She was listening. The next 2 hours were long and procedural. Claire gave a formal statement to 2 officers, then answered additional questions from Frances Keene, then waited while other people talked around her about things she was only partially following. She learned that the shot had been fired from a rifle, that the window on the 4th floor had no useful prints on it, that the shooter had entered and exited without being caught on any of the building's cameras, because the building's cameras were old, and 2 of them had not been working for several weeks. She learned that Carmelo Vitanza was not a name that the police said out loud in front of her. They referred to him in her presence simply as the individual, which she found almost funny, given that the individual was sitting 12 feet away in the same kitchen, listening to all of it. Paul, the manager, came to find her sometime after 11 and said she should go home, that she was done for the night, obviously. and that he would call her tomorrow, and that she should know the restaurant would cover anything she needed. He said this in the rushing, guilty way of a man who is not sure what the correct thing to offer is in a situation like this. She untied her apron and folded it over her arm. She picked up her bag from the hook near the door. She was almost at the back exit when she heard Carmelo's voice again. He said, "Miss Whitmore." She turned. He was standing now. He looked exactly as he had when she first saw him at the booth, before any of this had happened. The same stillness, the same careful attention in the eyes. It seemed impossible that anything had changed at all, except that across the dining room, behind him, his corner booth had a hole in the leather back and a hole in the plaster wall, and the night outside was filled with blue and red light from the vehicles on the street. He said, "Don't come back to work here." She looked at him. He said, "Not because of anything you did, because of what it means that you did it, and what some people might make of that." She understood what he was saying. Not fully, not all of it, but enough. She said, "All right." He nodded once. She went home. She sat in her apartment for a long time without turning on any lights. The street outside was quiet. The building was quiet. She was thinking about the red dot, about the way it had moved across the plaster wall, drifting and correcting, patient and purposeful. She was thinking about 12 steps across a restaurant floor, the distance between noticing and acting, between a feeling that could not be fully explained and a choice that could not be taken back. She had not been certain. She had acted anyway. She thought that was probably the most honest thing she could say about it. She finally turned on a light and made tea and sat at her kitchen table, and outside the city went on being the city, ordinary and loud and completely indifferent to what had nearly happened that night in a restaurant on a quiet street, where a man had ordered lamb and not eaten it, and a waitress had seen a light on a wall that had no reason to be there. Frances Keene had been a detective for 11 years, and she had seen most things at least once. She had worked cases that other people in the department quietly referred to as complicated, which was a word that covered a range of situations, everything from cases involving dangerous individuals to cases involving individuals who were connected to enough other people that the process of investigation became something closer to archaeology than police work, slow and layered and full of things that could not be moved without other things shifting underneath. The Vitanza case was, by any measure, one of the complicated ones. She sat in her car outside the restaurant until 2 in the morning, long after the other officers had gone, reading through everything she had been able to pull up on her tablet. The details that were public record painted a shape around the man, even if they never quite named the center of it. Carmelo Vitanza had been a figure of interest to law enforcement for more than 2 decades. There had been investigations. There had been charges, on 2 occasions, that did not result in convictions. There had been, over the years, a series of associates who came and went, some through legitimate channels, and some through the kind of channels that put their names in other files, in other departments, in federal records that Frances could request but could not always fully access. What she knew, based on everything available to her on that particular night, was this: Carmelo Vitanza ran things. The specifics of what he ran had never been fully established in a court of law, but the shape of his life, the money, the associates, the 2 men who had been with him at dinner, and who had known exactly what to do when a window broke, all of it pointed in a direction that was very clear, even if it could not be put into an arrest report. Someone had tried to have him shot tonight. That same someone had hired a professional to do it, a person who had spent hours in position and left almost no trace. That level of planning and that level of investment pointed not to an ordinary conflict, but to something deliberate, organized, and serious, which meant Frances was not just investigating an attempted shooting. She was standing at the edge of something much larger, looking in. She closed her tablet and looked at the restaurant window, which had been boarded up with a piece of plywood from somewhere in Paul Dunning's supply room. The jagged edge of the broken glass was still visible along the frame where the board did not quite cover it. She thought about Claire Whitmore. 26 years old, 3 months on the job, no criminal record, no unusual associations, no reason to be anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. And yet she had done something tonight that very few people would have done, or could have done. She had seen something small and wrong in a room full of distractions. She had processed it in the time it took to walk half the length of a restaurant floor, and she had acted on an instinct that she could not fully explain and had no certainty about. Frances had interviewed a lot of people. She had interviewed people in crisis and people who were lying, and people who were trying to be helpful, and people who had no idea they were sitting on information that mattered. Claire Whitmore had none of the signs of someone who was performing a story. She had the signs of someone who was remembering clearly and telling it as cleanly as she could, including the parts she was uncertain about, especially those parts. The part that kept returning to Frances was simple. Claire had noticed the light. She had walked away from it, and then her feet had slowed. That slowing, that involuntary hesitation, was the thing that Frances could not stop turning over, because it meant that the mind had registered something before the person knew what it was registering, that somewhere below conscious thought, a calculation had been made, and an alarm had been sent upward, and Claire had been present enough and quiet enough inside herself to hear it. That was not common. That was, in Frances's experience, the opposite of common. She started her car and drove back to the station. There were things to do. The building across the street needed to be gone over thoroughly, and it had been gone over once tonight already, but thoroughly meant more than once. The camera footage from the surrounding blocks needed to be pulled, every camera, working or not, because sometimes even broken cameras caught the edge of a frame that mattered. The rifle, if it could be found, would tell its own story. The entry point, the exit route, the timing, all of it needed to be built into a sequence that she could follow backward to a source. She also needed to find out who wanted Carmelo Vitanza dead badly enough to pay for this kind of work. That question had more than one possible answer, which was part of what made it difficult. A man in his position, with his history, collected enemies the way other people collected bills. Some of those enemies were individuals, some were organizations, some were both. She pulled into the parking garage and sat in the car for another minute before going inside. She was thinking about the shooter, 3 hours in position, patience, discipline, a clean setup with almost nothing left behind. That kind of work required more than willingness. It required training, and training left marks, and marks could be followed. She got out of the car. The station was quiet at this hour, the particular quiet of a building that does not stop but slows, where the fluorescent lights are too bright, and the coffee is too old, and the people who are still there have the focused, slightly hollowed look of people working in the middle of the night on things that cannot wait until morning. She sat at her desk and pulled up everything she had. She spread it in front of her the way you spread a map, looking for the shape of the terrain before you try to navigate it. Carmelo Vitanza, 54. 3 months ago, according to sources she trusted, there had been a shift in the distribution of certain kinds of business in the city, the kind of shift that happens when one set of arrangements ends and another set has not yet fully formed. Shifts like that were almost always followed by tension. Tension was almost always followed by something more specific. She had a timeline now. The shift, then the tension, then tonight. What she did not have was the link between the tension and the man on the 4th floor of the insurance building. That link was the case. Everything else was context. She started making calls. The first one went to a man named Gregory Shaw, who worked in a division whose exact name Frances had always found slightly absurd, because the name was very official and the work it described was anything but. Gregory Shaw knew things about organized networks in the city that did not appear in any public record, and he and Frances had a history of trading information carefully, each one measuring what they gave against what they got, the way people do when they respect each other but also understand the rules. Gregory answered on the 4th ring, which meant he had been awake. She told him what had happened. She gave him the name. There was a pause on the other end that lasted about 3 seconds. Then Gregory said, "Vitanza," not as a question. She said yes. He said, "When?" She told him the time. She told him about the 4th floor, the rifle, the clean setup. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "There's been noise for about 6 weeks. Coming from the eastern side of things, someone new, or someone who wants people to think they're new, feels coordinated, feels like it's been building." She wrote that down. Coordinated how? Money moving, people repositioning. 3 middlemen who were in one arrangement, suddenly in another. You don't make those kinds of moves without a reason, and you don't make them that fast unless you're planning something. She thought about that. And the shooter? That's a different question, Gregory said. That's someone with a specific capability set. That's not local. That's brought in, which meant brought in from somewhere, which meant a chain, which meant a chain had 2 ends, and she only had one of them. She thanked him and told him she would call him in the morning. She ended the call and sat for a moment with her hand still on the phone, thinking about chains. about the person at the far end of one, whoever had made the call, whoever had decided that tonight was the night and that the fourth floor of an empty building was the right place for it. Somewhere in the city, that person had watched the night go wrong. Somewhere in the city, that person was making their own calls right now, trying to find out what had happened, why the thing they had paid for had not been delivered, what had interrupted 11 months of planning at the last possible second. She wondered if they knew yet about the waitress. She wondered what they would think when they found out. She picked up her phone again and dialed. There were more people to call, more pieces to pull into order, and the night was already more than half over. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the small hours, breathing slow, streets mostly empty, a few lights on in high windows where other people were awake for their own reasons, working through their own versions of the night. She did not think about Carmelo Vitanza anymore that evening. She thought about the chain, about where it began and who held the other end of it. She thought that finding that person was going to be the most important thing she had done in 11 years. She thought she was probably right. Carmelo did not sleep that night. He went to a house that only 4 people knew about, a narrow 3-story building on the edge of a neighborhood that had been in transition for years, neither fully changed nor fully what it used to be, the kind of place where no one paid much attention to who came and went. He had used this house before, on 2 other occasions when something had gone sideways and it had become necessary to step outside his normal patterns until the geometry of the situation became clearer. His name for this kind of night was a realignment, not a crisis. A crisis implied something unexpected. This was not unexpected, not entirely. There had been signals for weeks, the kind of signals that you learn to read after long enough, small shifts in how people spoke to him and around him, certain faces absent from certain places, a feeling in the air of things gathering towards something without the gathering yet being complete. He had been preparing for a realignment. He had simply not known the exact shape it would take. He sat in the front room of the house with a glass of water and did not turn on the television. One of his men, a quiet man named Owen Darby who had been with him for 9 years, sat in the kitchen doing whatever Owen did when there was nothing specific to do, which was mostly look at his phone in silence. Another man, whose name was Colin Reese and who had been at the restaurant earlier that evening, was upstairs doing something that Carmelo did not ask about and did not need to. The other man who had been at dinner, the one who had gone toward the side exit, his name was Gerald Price. Gerald was somewhere Carmelo did not currently know, which was not unusual. Gerald operated on his own schedule and by his own methods and always had, and Carmelo had learned years ago that trying to track Gerald's movements was both unnecessary and counterproductive. Gerald would appear when Gerald had something useful to say. Carmelo sat with his water and thought about the chain of events. The shot had been clean. The position had been chosen well. The timing had been deliberate, the kind of deliberate that comes from watching a person's habits long enough to know that Tuesday evenings meant Aldo's, and Aldo's meant the corner booth. Someone had been watching his habits. Someone had been watching long enough to build a plan around them. He was not angry about this exactly. Anger in situations like this was a luxury that cost more than it gave back. What he felt was something cooler and more functional, a heightened attention, a sharpening of the quality of thinking that he reserved for problems that required it. He was, in the language he used only inside himself, now fully awake in a way that ordinary life did not require. He thought about who wanted this result. The list was not short. He had operated for 23 years in a world where the list of people who might want you out of the picture was never short, if you were doing your job. That was simply the nature of the territory. But a list of general discontents was different from a list of people who would invest in the kind of operation that had been attempted tonight. That level of effort, that level of precision, it narrowed the possibilities considerably. 3 names came to his mind. He examined each one carefully, the way you examine something you have handled many times but are now looking at with fresh eyes, turning it in the light, checking for things you might have missed before. The first name was a man named Leonard Voss, who ran distribution channels on the western end of the city, and who had, in recent months, expressed unhappiness about certain arrangements in ways that had been politely but clearly communicated back to Carmelo through people who communicated these things. Leonard Voss was the kind of man who complained loudly before he acted quietly. The complaint had come. Carmelo had been expecting the quiet action. The second name was a name he knew only as an organization rather than a person. A group of interests from outside the city that had, over the past 18 months, been looking for points of entry into local arrangements. They had tried negotiation first, which Carmelo had declined. They had then tried a different kind of pressure, which he had also declined, at some cost. The next logical step for an organization that had tried 2 approaches and been refused both times was a third approach, and a third approach at this level of the conversation had only one form. The third name surprised him slightly when it arrived. It was someone he had trusted, someone inside his own structure, not directly, but one layer removed. A person who had access to the kind of information you would need to know a man's Tuesday evening habits, to know which restaurant and which table, to know that the window on the 4th floor would give you the angle you needed. He sat with that third name for a long time. The water in his glass was warm by the time Owen came to the kitchen doorway and said, in his quiet way, that Colin had found something. Carmelo set down the glass and went upstairs. Colin Reese was at a table with a laptop and a phone and several pieces of paper with things written on them. He was 29, and he had a mind for patterns and connections that Carmelo had valued from the first time he understood it. He looked up when Carmelo came in and said, without preamble, "The building across the street from Aldo's, the insurance company that rents the 4th floor." I pulled the rental records through a contact. The rental was signed 18 months ago by a company that doesn't appear to exist in any registry I can find. The lease was paid a year in advance, in full, at signing. Carmelo looked at him. 18 months ago. Colin said yes. 18 months. That was before the negotiations with the outside organization had collapsed. That was before Leonard Voss had begun complaining. That was, Carmelo understood, before most of the things he had been considering as possible causes. 18 months ago, someone had rented a building across the street from a restaurant where he had a standing Tuesday evening reservation and had paid a year in advance for the privilege. He felt something shift in how he was holding the problem. He said, "The third name." Colin looked at him. He did not know what the third name was. He did not ask. Carmelo said, "A year and a half ago. Who was changing positions? Who was moving to a new place in the structure?" Colin thought about it. He said, "Walter Crane." Carmelo had not said Walter Crane's name out loud in months. He stood in the room on the top floor of the narrow house and thought about Walter Crane, who had been a trusted part of his world for 6 years, and who had, 18 months ago, shifted to a new role on the edge of things, close enough to know the interior, but far enough that leaving would not be noticed the way leaving from the center would be noticed. He thought about the Tuesday evenings, about who knew them. Walter Crane had known them. He said, "Find him." Colin nodded and turned back to the laptop. Carmelo went back downstairs and sat again in the front room. The street outside was completely still now. The hour was the one just before the sky begins to change, when the dark is at its deepest, not because the night is growing stronger, but because what is coming is still too far away to matter. He thought about Claire Whitmore. He did not know much about her. He had been aware of her in the way you are aware of the background of a room you have been in many times, present but not examined. Tonight he had looked at her properly for the first time, a young woman with steady hands and a clear way of speaking, who had seen a light on a wall and done the most difficult thing there is to do with an instinct you cannot fully explain, which is to trust it completely. He owed her a life, his own. He was not a sentimental man, and he did not think of it in sentimental terms. He thought of it in the plain terms of a ledger, which was how he thought of most things. A debt existed. Debts were addressed. The how and the when were practical questions, not emotional ones. He also thought about what he had told her before she left the kitchen. Don't come back here, because what she had done would be known, in certain circles, within a matter of days. And in those circles, a person who had prevented the thing from happening was not someone who would be viewed with gratitude by the people who had arranged the thing. He had told her to go. He hoped she would go far. He sat in the front room until the sky began to change. Then he went upstairs to the second bedroom and lay down without taking off his shoes, and closed his eyes, and was asleep in under 2 minutes, the way a man sleeps who has long since made peace with the knowledge that the world does not stop turning while he rests, and that rest taken efficiently is better than rest not taken at all. Owen Darby, in the kitchen, heard the house go quiet and looked at his phone and thought about nothing in particular, and the city outside moved slowly toward morning. Frances Keene slept for 3 hours and was back at her desk by 6:15. The coffee was fresh, at least. Someone who cared about the quality of the morning had made a proper pot rather than the burned one that sat on the burner from the previous evening, She poured a cup and stood by the window for a moment, looking at the street below, and then she went and sat down and picked up where she had left off. The night had produced 3 things of use. The first was a fragment of security footage from a camera mounted on the corner of a dry cleaning business 2 blocks from Aldo's. The camera was old and the image quality was poor, but at 9:43, 11 minutes after the shot was fired, it had caught a vehicle moving away from the direction of the insurance building, a dark sedan, moving at a measured speed, not fast enough to be running, not slow enough to be waiting. The plates were not readable from the angle and the quality, but the shape of the vehicle, the make and model, was something a technician was working on. The second thing was a name that Gregory Shaw had called her back with at 5 in the morning, because Gregory Shaw apparently also did not sleep. He had said one word, the name of a man he described as a specialist of sorts, someone who moved between cities and between jobs, and who left the same kind of absence behind him that the insurance building had been left with. He could not confirm it. He said she should treat it as a direction, not a fact. The third thing was a request from the Federal Division, which had arrived at her desk at 10 minutes past 5, in the form of an email from a name she recognized, asking to be briefed on the incident and its connection to ongoing investigations, which meant the Federal Division had ongoing investigations and considered last night's incident connected to them. Which was interesting. She called the number in the email. A man named Andrew Page answered. He had the voice of someone who spent a lot of time being careful with words, precise and slightly formal, the kind of voice that was not unfriendly, but was professionally measured. She told him what she had. She held back the footage, not because she intended to keep it, but because she wanted to understand the shape of his interest before she committed to sharing everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The building across the street from the restaurant. 18 months ago, a company called Aero Meridian Limited signed the lease." She wrote that down. "That name means something to you?" He said, "It's a shell. We've traced it through 3 other shells before it goes dark, but 2 of the other shells have appeared in other contexts. One of them in a property transaction connected to a network we've been tracking for about 2 years. The other in a financial structure that belongs to a man named Walter Crane." She said, "Walter Crane." He said yes. And then he told her what he knew about Walter Crane, which was more than she had, and less than either of them needed. Walter Crane was 47 years old. He had spent the first part of his adult life in construction management, which was not unusual. Construction management was a field with a lot of movement between the legitimate and the illegitimate, because the money was large and the oversight was uneven, and the connections required tended to cross lines in both directions. He had moved, over time, from the fringes of one particular network toward its interior, and had then, 18 months ago, begun doing something that Andrew Page described as restructuring his position. Francis said, meaning he was moving away from someone while maintaining access. Andrew Page said, "That's one interpretation." She thought about it. "He's not an independent. He was working for Vitanza's network and he was positioning to work against it. That means someone flipped him or he was waiting for the right offer, and someone made it." "Also a reasonable interpretation," she said. "Can you share the financial records?" A pause. "I can share what falls within the scope of a state-level homicide investigation, which this now qualifies as, given that a shot was fired." She accepted that and said she would send a formal request by end of day. After she hung up, she sat for a moment with the name Walter Crane, and what it meant in the larger shape of things. It meant the shooting was not random. It was not opportunistic. It was the product of a plan that had been building for 18 months, and the person at the center of that plan was not the man on the 4th floor with the rifle. The man on the 4th floor was a tool. Walter Crane, or the people who had used Walter Crane, was the hand that had picked up the tool. She thought about Carmelo Vitanza sitting on a metal stool in the kitchen of a restaurant, completely still, folding nothing in particular. She thought about a shot going through a window and tearing through the back of a leather booth. She thought about 12 steps across a restaurant floor. She pulled up everything she could find on Walter Crane and began to read. Outside, the city was fully awake now, the early morning traffic building on the street below her window, ordinary life in full motion, people going to work and buying coffee and making the small daily choices that made up the texture of normal time. Somewhere in that ordinary city, Walter Crane was awake too, or had never slept, and was aware that something had gone wrong last night, and was making his own calculations about what came next. She was making hers. The forensics team sent their preliminary report at 8:30. The rifle had not been found. The position on the 4th floor had been cleared with extraordinary care, the kind of care that was itself a piece of information, because it spoke to a level of training and discipline that ruled out certain types of operators and pointed toward others. Trace materials were minimal. One partial fiber that might lead somewhere or might not. A small scuff on the floor near the window that matched no shoe type in any common database. The vehicle from the footage was confirmed by 7 that morning as a dark blue sedan, a specific make and model that was common enough to be difficult and specific enough to be a start. It had not appeared on any other camera in the surrounding area, which meant the driver knew the camera locations, which was another piece of information. She built the timeline on the whiteboard beside her desk, the way she built all of them, in a straight horizontal line with the known events marked and the gaps visible. The gaps were where the work happened. The gaps were what needed filling. She stepped back and looked at the line. 18 months of preparation. A building rented for a year in advance. A shooter brought in from outside the city. A specific Tuesday evening at a specific restaurant at a specific table, and then a young woman noticing a light on a wall. Between the plan and the outcome, 12 steps and a red dot on a wall. She thought that was probably the most interesting gap on the timeline. The one that had no name yet and no explanation that would fully satisfy. The gap where intention ended and something else entirely took over. She capped her marker and went to find the technical team to ask about the vehicle footage. There was a lot of work still to do. Walter Crane's location was not yet known. The shooter was somewhere in the city or was already gone. The network that had funded and organized the operation was still intact and still operational. None of the central questions were answered. But the shape of the thing was coming clear, the way a picture comes clear when you have found enough of the edges. She was at the stage of the work she liked best, which was the stage when chaos began to resolve into something that could be followed. She walked down the hall, coffee in hand, thinking about edges. Claire Whitmore did not go back to Aldo's. She did not go back the night after the shooting, which was obvious. And she did not go back the week after. And eventually she called Paul Dunning and told him she would not be coming back at all. He accepted this with the relief of a man who had been hoping for exactly this outcome but had not known how to ask for it. He told her she would receive 2 additional weeks of pay, which she did not argue about because she needed it. She spent the first week staying mostly inside. Not because she was afraid to go out, not exactly, but because the outside felt louder than it usually did, more textured, more full of things to notice. And she needed some time before she was ready to notice that much again. The police called her twice more. She answered all their questions. Francis Keene called her once separately, not with questions but to tell her, in a careful and indirect way, that the investigation was progressing and that Claire should be thoughtful about her movements for a while. She did not explain what thoughtful meant in specific terms, but Claire understood the outline of it. She thought about what Carmelo had said in the kitchen, not because of anything you did, because of what it means that you did it. She understood that too. The envelope that had been left on the prep counter in the kitchen had contained a sum of money that she did not feel entirely comfortable thinking about directly. She put it in the back of a drawer and did not take it out for 3 weeks. When she finally did take it out, she sat with it for a long time, thinking about what it was and what she should do with it. In the end, she made a practical decision about it, one that involved a savings account she had mostly neglected and a few bills she had been managing 1 month at a time. She did not think of it as payment. She was not sure what she thought of it as exactly. She put it in the account and left it there, and tried not to build a story around it. She had a lot of time to think in those weeks. She thought about the moment on the restaurant floor when her feet had slowed. She tried to reconstruct it carefully, the way you reconstruct a sequence of events after the fact when the events themselves passed too quickly to observe them as they happened. She thought about what she had seen and what she had known, and the gap between the two, the gap that was the decision, the one that could not be fully explained in terms of information or logic because it had not been made entirely in those terms. She thought that the closest she could get to describing it was this: her brain had finished a calculation that it had not shown her the work for. That was the best she could do. It was not very satisfying as an explanation, but it was honest. She applied for a position with a security consulting firm that a friend of a friend had mentioned. The application asked about background and experience, and she filled it out truthfully, leaving out the parts she could not include, and including the parts she could. She was called for an interview 2 weeks after she sent it, and she went, and she sat across from a woman named Patricia Helm and answered questions for 40 minutes. Patricia Helm asked, at the end of the interview, what made her interested in this kind of work. Claire thought about how to answer that. She said, "I think I'm good at noticing things that aren't in the right place. I'd like to do something with that." Patricia Helm looked at her for a moment, in the considering way of someone who is deciding whether a person is telling them something small or something large. Then she said, "Give me an example." Claire told her about the red dot. She told it plainly, without adding anything to it, the way she had told Frances Keene. The couple at the table, the plates she was setting down, the light on the wall that had no reason to be there, the walk across the restaurant floor. She left out Carmelo's name because it was not relevant to the example, and because she had developed, in the weeks since that evening, an instinct about which details to include and which to let stay quiet. When she finished, Patricia Helm was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "How long between when you saw the light and when you got to the table?" Claire said, "About 45 seconds." Patricia Helm said, "And in that 45 seconds you convinced yourself enough to act." Claire said, "I wasn't convinced. I acted anyway." Patricia Helm looked at her for another long moment. She said, "When can you start?" Claire started 3 weeks later. The work was not dramatic on most days. It involved attention and patience, and the ability to sit with uncertainty long enough to see through it to the thing on the other side. She was, she discovered, well suited to it. She did not find the waiting difficult. She did not find the uncertainty difficult. She had learned something in a restaurant on a Tuesday evening that she could not fully put into words but that shaped the way she worked, which was this: the moment of not quite knowing is not the problem. The moment of not quite knowing is the work. The investigation into the shooting at Aldo's restaurant ran for 14 months. It produced 2 arrests, one of which resulted in a conviction. Walter Crane was not among those arrested. Walter Crane had disappeared from the city sometime in the week following the shooting, and despite the efforts of Frances Keene and Andrew Page, and several other people in several different agencies, he remained, as of the close of the primary investigation, not found. Carmelo Vitanza was never called as a witness. His name appeared in the case file and nowhere else in the official record. Frances Keene closed the case as partially resolved and moved on to the next one, because there was always a next one, and the work did not wait for the satisfaction of complete answers. She thought about the case sometimes, the way you think about the cases that stay with you, not constantly but in the background, a shape in the edge of your thinking. She thought most often not about Walter Crane or the shooter, or the long chain of money and decisions that had led to one Tuesday night at one restaurant. She thought most often about 45 seconds. About the distance between a light on a wall and a choice made without certainty. She thought that most of the important things people did were made in that space, in the gap between what was known and what was needed, and that the people who could move through that gap without freezing were rare and worth paying attention to. She hoped Claire Whitmore was doing well. She thought she probably was. Carmelo Vitanza died 4 years and 3 months after the evening at Aldo's restaurant. He died in a house that 4 people knew about, in a bed, in his sleep, of a heart that had been working too hard for too long and finally declined to work anymore. The 3 people who were notified before anyone else were not surprised, and were not exactly grief-stricken, and were not exactly relieved. They were people who had long since made peace with the kind of world he had lived in, which meant they had made peace with impermanence and uncertainty, and the fact that knowing someone could end in ways that had nothing to do with how you felt about them. He was survived by a daughter who lived in another country, a son who had gone into law, and a grandson he had met twice. He was also survived by a story, the kind of story that passes between people in certain rooms in certain cities, told carefully and quietly, about a Tuesday evening and a corner booth, and a man who had survived 23 years of difficult choices, only to be saved, at the end, by a light on a wall and a woman who trusted something she could not explain. The story got things wrong in the retelling, the way stories do. It grew in some places and compressed in others. The 45 seconds became a minute, then 2. The red dot became a red beam. The woman became various versions of herself depending on who was telling it. But the center of it stayed true. She had noticed something small in a loud room. She had acted without certainty. and a man had walked through a door and kept breathing. In the end, that was the whole of it. The rest was detail. Claire Whitmore, on a Tuesday evening 4 years and 5 months after the shooting, was sitting in a small restaurant in a different city when she noticed the red dot on the wall. Not a laser sight, a reflection from the taillight of a car outside, coming through the window at a low angle and landing on the plaster 6 inches above a couple's table. She looked at it for a moment. She looked at where it was coming from. She went back to her meal. The dot faded when the car moved, and the wall was plain again, and the restaurant continued being a restaurant, warm and full of the quiet sounds of people eating and talking and living their ordinary lives. She finished her dinner. She left a good tip. She walked home through a city that did not know her name, and the night was cool and clear, and she paid attention to everything around her the way she always did now, out of practice and out of something that had become, without her quite deciding it, a part of who she was. Not caution, something quieter than that. Just attention. Just the plain, steady habit of looking at the world as it actually was, and noticing when something in it was not quite right. It was not a dramatic thing to carry. It did not look like anything from the outside. But it was, she had come to understand, the most useful thing she had.